At its very core, drug science must remain independent. This means we don't accept sponsorships. It's with the support of the drug science community we're able to do this and make the podcast in the first place. If you're able to become a drug science community member and support the show, you too will be supporting the dissemination of evidence-based drug policies. Without you, none of this would be possible. For anybody interested, there's a link in the show notes. Thank you. Hello and welcome to the Drug Science Podcast with me, David Nutt. Here we're bringing together experts and activists for a rational, honest and informed conversation about drugs. Hello and welcome to another Drug Science Podcast. This is me, David Nutt, and today my guest is Mattha Busby. He's a journalist and a writer. He's just published a book called Should All Drugs Be Legalized? And he's speaking to me today from Costa Rica, where he's having a well-deserved rest after being at the front line of research on the war on drugs in Mexico. So welcome, Mattha.
Hi, thanks very much for having me on the show, David.
So tell us a little bit about how you got into this drug field and the research and writing about drugs.
I was working for The Guardian in the office in 2018 when the medical cannabis campaign blew up. And I was already in touch with the campaigners due to, one or two previous pieces. And the editors put me on the story and it all kind of went from there. But drugs have affected my life massively. There's been serious addiction in my family, and I've had my own trials and tribulations and delight with drugs and alcohol. But ultimately, difficult experiences, which has led me to my sober life now.
All right. Hey.
And the publisher approached me on the basis of my reporting for various publications. And let's do it. That was about 3 years ago when the subject was a lot more taboo than it is today. And I moved to Mexico about a year and a half ago and haven't really looked back.
Whereabouts in Mexico are you staying?
I live on the coast of Oaxaca. I've moved around a little bit, but that's where I've been since the end of November. Lots of opium fields nearby, apparently.
But you're away from the worst of the troubles anyway, at least the worst of the violence.
Yes, that seems to be pretty much around the border, and then in Michoacan, which is like a few states up to the west of Oaxaca. But it seems that, trouble kind of finds trouble in it. And, apart from some kind of incidents in Tulum and around the Yucatan where tourists have got caught in the crossfire, sadly it is, pretty much, gang on gang, war on war.
Yes. Yeah, a lot of people don't realize that Mexico is actually a United States country. It's made of quite a number, I can't remember how many, 11 or so different states, isn't it? And they have really quite different cultures and different aspirations and different problems.
Yes, very much so. I mean, I was living in Chiapas for a while last year, which is the southernmost state next to Guatemala, and they have this corridor, running through where there's also people migrating, but also, human trafficking alongside a lot of the drugs, and there's kind of militias that kind of, control those areas, and sometimes, it really does spill over. But Oaxaca, it seems pretty calm in comparison to Chiapas. And the structure of Mexico is very interesting, and each state has its own character. And many people seem to forget that I think almost half of Mexico was robbed as the spoils of war by the Americans in the mid-19th century, which explains why so many cities in the south of the US have Spanish names. Yeah.
So are you out there for research, or was it part of your developing the background for your book, or is it a reward for having achieved what is quite a challenging thing to do, to actually finish a book?
I mean, it's only 20,000 words, although the draft was about twice that length, and it did take a while to boil it all down. It's kind of like a poppy product.
Yeah.
You can read it in probably 2 sittings. There's about 160 photos. The publisher, Thames and Hudson, did an incredible job of putting it together. And I hope that it does kind of break new ground in a way as that kind of coffee table fodder. And I guess it brings the subject a bit closer to the mainstream in a way. But it would have been nice to do the kind of thing that Anthony Lowenstein, did with Pills, Powder and Smoke, or Johann Hari with Chasing the Scream. But, they've already kind of done it. So I guess for my next tome, I have to find some uncharted territory. But yeah, the book was kind of done when I moved out to Mexico at the end of March. It was more because I'd always wanted to live in Mexico since I visited, and it's a dream to be able to speak fluent Spanish, work in progress. I've done a few stories out here, and that's actually why I came to Costa Rica for this month to report on a story for Vice.
Yeah, I mean, you're one of my most regular correspondents. Maybe I should put it that way. I get more emails from you than most journalists. You're always nudging me for comments on various drug topics. So you're obviously writing for newspapers and journals as well as books.
Yeah, so I've been lucky enough to be able to report on a lot of stories concerning drug policy. And obviously, with your work at Awaken, the Ketamine Clinic, and Imperial, and also the papers that you're involved in researching and writing, you've really been at the forefront of many of these developments, which are happening at a real startling pace, in the psychedelic world, especially over the last 3 or 4 years. And yeah, I've been able to sort of carve a little bit of a niche out and develop an expertise. So if there's a story going, I might pitch it, or an editor might ask me to follow it up. But yeah, I've still got plenty of space in my calendar.
And I was at a conference in Toronto a couple of months ago, and there were some Mexicans there, and they were asking me to come over to do some lectures later this year. I can't do that for personal reasons. But I was surprised to discover that there are people getting arrested in Mexico for bringing ayahuasca into the country. And I was under the impression that basically Mexico allowed anything that grew naturally. But it seems like maybe ayahuasca doesn't grow in Mexico, just the mushrooms. I mean, Sarah, I'd be fascinated to know if you've got any insights into the psychedelic space in Mexico. Is that something that you rub shoulders with?
Well, that's partly why I came to Costa Rica to report on the iboga tourism, the African psychedelic, from the root of a shrub in Gabon, which with its derivative ibogaine is most well known as a treatment for addiction. And there's many ayahuasca retreats and ceremonies that are held here. And although also, there are also in Mexico ayahuasca ceremonies, it's telling that most people come to Costa Rica to do it because they feel more comfortable. In Mexico, I know one retreat, a very well-known retreat, was scoping out doing it on the West Coast, but the cartel started trading in psilocybin, so they didn't feel comfortable doing it there. So then now they're doing it in Jamaica, which is quite interestingly also carving itself out as a kind of psilocybin magic mushroom retreat hub. But yeah,
I've heard that. Yeah, Jamaica is actually becoming quite progressive. It's obviously got a strong tradition of cannabis, and it's making high quality cannabis for medical use now. But I heard that it legalized the mushrooms a year or so ago, and as you say, casting itself as a good destination for sort of both recreation and medical uses of mushrooms. Yeah. Whereas people feel Mexico is dangerous, so Costa Rica feels safer, does it?
I mean, Costa Rica doesn't have a military. That there was a brief civil war in the 40s, and I think there was just a collective realization of the folly of war. So yeah, I mean, it's such a peaceful country. The land is clearly very blessed. But yeah, I don't think, mushrooms might grow here, but yeah, it doesn't have the same indigenous history of psychedelic use like you have in Mexico, in Oaxaca, in Huautla, the town of Maria Sabina, which I also visited recently. And, there's a long history of healers in the area holding mushroom ceremonies. And then further north in San Luis de Potosí and Chihuahua, in the desert where peyote grows, the Wilarica people have for thousands of years, worked with this medicine. It's very central to their origin story. And
do you want to just share a little bit? Not everyone who listens to this podcast will be as familiar with Maria as you are. So you want to share about the discovery of mushrooms by the Western world?
Absolutely. I have a story forthcoming on this, and I interviewed her grandson and her great nephew last month at the museum at her home, which was very, very fascinating. The brief story is that in the 50s, an amateur mycologist and Wall Street banker, he was a vice president at JP Morgan, Gordon Wasson, had heard about a mythical substance, Teo and then had also read some intriguing passages from Spanish chroniclers from the 16th and 17th century where they spoke of mushroom ceremonies. So after a couple of visits to Oaxaca and around Huautla de Jimenez, he was eventually invited to a ceremony held by Maria Sabina in which magic mushrooms grown in the area. There's about 5 varieties, including the most popular, I think, called Jambe. And he broadcast his findings to the world in an article in 1957 in Life magazine, in which the word magic mushrooms was coined. And the West and the rest of the world kind of collectively woke up to the reality of magic mushrooms growing all around us, apart from, in real difficult climates, but even where it is, more snowy, it's kind of different varieties like Amanita muscaria that grow. It's an interesting question. Was the knowledge of magic mushrooms lost, during the Inquisition, Roman attacks on Druids? Because even in Mexico, they kept it to themselves. Maria Sabina and her community, they weren't shouting it from the rooftops, just in the same way that in other parts of the world, such as the Taoists, did keep their kind of esoteric practices secret. And even when they did write them down, I think at the turn of the 2nd century, they wrote it in very coded language, so the uninitiated couldn't easily benefit from the practices.
You can understand why the Mexicans wouldn't want to make it public, because they were being killed off by the Spanish.
Exactly.
In those early days of the invasion, and then their culture was trying to be exterminated. And I think there was a systematic attempt by the Spanish to eliminate all references to other deities and to the use of drugs to experience them.
Exactly. I think the missionaries will, some with good intentions, I'm sure, but others, were fundamentally trying to pull the people of Mexico away from other sources of spiritual power.
Mm.
So yeah, it's no surprise that in the 50s, the people that had, kept the tradition and kept the knowledge going, were difficult to find. But as I say, Wasson's findings, also backfired in a way, and there was an explosion of tourism to the area.
Has it recovered from that? I mean, obviously, if they got a museum, I guess they have. I guess they're celebrating the fact that they did lead the West on a new path. But it was very turbulent for quite a few decades, wasn't it, when the West came in and kind of exploited their knowledge of the mushroom?
Exactly. I think there was kind of rapid cultural changes, and some people didn't behave consciously. Stories of people swigging mezcal, smoking weed in the streets, and tripping out on mushrooms. And for a very rural, humble community, I think that definitely caused ructions. And Maria Sabina suffered. She was jailed for a time. Her house was set on fire. She was victimized by parts of the community that were jealous or otherwise towards her. And eventually the military had to step in and prevent visitors to the town, foreign visitors, for about a decade. But now, yeah, the town has seems to be pretty stable. Apparently it receives about 300, 400, mostly Mexican tourists per week. There's a couple dozen healers. And yeah, it has like an interesting energy, that the town, for sure. Like, you're kind of like in many places in Mexico, you're in the sort of Wild West, and yeah, one has to find one's way a little bit. And I'm sure there's some people out there to exploit people, is what I've heard from the guide, we found through friends. But everyone was very lovely to us and very, very welcoming, very, very hospitable. And yeah, we enjoyed buying flowers, which we gave as gifts to some of the people, and undergoing some of the local tours and eating the local food. The habali, wild boar, was an interesting delicacy. So yeah, we had a wonderful time, and there were many other tourists there at the time with us.
Yeah, so that's one area where what you might call experiential tourism seems now to got into equilibrium. I suppose a bit like ayahuasca is coming into equilibrium in places and parts of Brazil and Peru. I guess the peyote is still a bit of a problem, because I don't think there's so much of it. And it's, how is Mexico viewing peyote?
Yes, I recently reported on this for Open Democracy. I think of all the natural psychedelics, peyote faces the most acute conservation issues. I mean, many people in Mexico don't even know what it is. Never mind have really worked with it. Like, you know, in many ways, it is still the kind of preserve of the seekers, many of whom are foreign. But Wirikuta, which is near to the old mining town of Real de Catorce, is the kind of mecca for the Wirarika people. And yeah, as I say, very close to their origin story, as there's the hill that is believed to have given birth to the sun just above the town. And there's regular pilgrimages to the town. And I think it sees, thousands, tens of thousands of visitors. There's serious issues over poaching of peyote, and there isn't really any cultivation plans. It's very kind of laissez-faire.
Yeah.
Increasingly, the seeds are being replanted from ceremonies. But yeah, it's difficult because the Wirarika actually live in the Sierra Madre, which is, you know, above the desert. So they don't live on the land, you know, of which they are in some senses custodians. And, you know, recent incursions by agribusiness, you know, massive greenhouses to grow tomatoes and keep chickens have been erected on top of the land which grows peyote, which has been excavated, you know, real large swathes of land. So that's just compounding some of the issues after kind of ranchers have bought the land for grazing their cattle. But there's interesting projects underway, and it also grows in Texas and Arizona, I believe, north of the border. And I recently heard that a chap in Canada had grown 13,000 peyote buttons over the course of about 30 years in his parents' greenhouses. And he just sent the first 4,000 to the Comanche tribe. And it took about 3 years to get the authorization from the DEA. But yeah, now they're figuring out how to get the next 9,000 down there. And, you know, it might even be, you know, a bit of a drop in the ocean considering how much is eaten at the moment. But if you think if the seeds are properly replanted and that, you know, there's a couple dozen seeds in each button, then yeah, I think it's a very, very promising project.
So that's cultural repatriation as opposed to appropriation, paying back the debt. Yes,
exactly. I think the chap had some real positively life-changing experiences with the medicine and wanted to find a way to give back. And it seems that he has certainly done that.
But in the sort of general popular press and media in Mexico, is there any recognition of this, or is it all about the cocaine and the opium battles across the border?
There was a fabulous piece in the student press, actually. A real excellent long read. Unfortunately, I can't remember the publication, but perhaps I can link it whenever the podcast gets published.
Yeah, do that.
But as far as I understand from my light reading of Mexican media, yeah, I mean, a lot of it's focused on the high politics, not so dissimilar to the UK media. And yeah, I don't think, they're so interested in the trials and tribulations of the conservation of a obscure cactus, which is used by, you know, a tribe of several tens of thousands of people. But I think across the world, the consciousness about peyote is growing. There's a recent Patti Smith album which pays homage to it. The president of the World Boxing Council was recently waxing lyrical about peyote, and obviously Hunter S. Thompson and Aldous Huxley brought mescaline into our collective consciousness originally. So yeah, it's something, you know, largely unique to Mexico.
But I'm trying to get at it. There's not a sense in which they celebrate being, you know, the forebears. I'm just interested to know, you know, whether it's not something that is being celebrated or talked about particularly. But it's not being oppressed.
The conversation at the moment is about cannabis. That is really making news because the Supreme Court have made like a series of judgments which have steadily kind of dismantled the prohibition regime, at least in case law. And I've been covering this in some detail for Leafly, the cannabis website. And that's basically forced the hand of lawmakers to legislate. And a bill has been on the table for the last year and a half, maybe longer. And there's kind of ping pong between the two houses. And now it really does seem just like a kind of purposeful delaying. AMLO, the president, has kind of flip-flopped on it. He recently suggested a referendum and then said later, more broadly, that, you know, there was no consensus on the legalization of drugs. But Oaxaca, the state where I live, the city council in April just declared cannabis kind of legal, kind of decriminalized, and basically said that people had carte blanche to smoke it even on the streets, so long as, they weren't harassing anybody and, smoking in the face of children, which is obviously reasonable demand. So yeah, there's an industry kind of growing apace, a grey industry. Dispensaries are opening up in some of the main cities, kind of boutique kind of outlets. And, cannabis is very easily found. Many people smoke it openly and privately. Although in some places, that the influence of the cartel is quite profound. And, I've heard stories about people getting a tap on the shoulder quite aggressively, because the cartel member has recognized that they're not smoking their weed. They're smoking something, stronger. And, they've had to, I don't know, give them some money or say sorry or even hand over their weed as a consequence. So, yeah, there's many things in Mexico. It's kind of surreal. It's a hodgepodge. And, yeah, the media, I think, are largely that's where any kind of drug focus is centered, along with the kind of trial of some former officials in the Calderon government who have been up to no good.
So, if obviously, when we look to Mexico, we think about the devastation and the hundreds of thousands of deaths in the hands of the cartels. But there's much less of that in the Western media at present. Is that just because we've been deflected to Ukraine and into climate crises, or is there less of it, on the ground as well? Are there less deaths? Is it settling down?
AMLO's hugs, not guns policy broadly led state forces to be kind of policing the borders between cartels. Mm-hmm. But the general murder rate hasn't decreased. In fact, it's increased. And notably journalists, there's been a real upshot in journalists getting killed, mostly by cartel members this year. I think it's up, horrific and sadly to about 14 Mexican journalists killed this year, which is just horrific. And I think AMLO has some serious questions, to answer, which he has deflected from. As I mentioned at the beginning of the conversation, there's been some turf wars in the Yucatan and Michoacan, where there's the war between the El Chapo cartel and the New Generation Jalisco cartel, among others. But I think broadly speaking, the levels haven't gone back to, the late noughties after Calderon declared, this militarized war on drugs. Recently, there's been continued fallout from the deaths of and disappearance of the 43 students a few years back, because an official report found that the military had been tracking them and that were largely aware of, how their bus they had been on was commandeered and that they were taken and killed and didn't do anything. So that's taken a bit of attention in the Mexican media recently.
Yeah, I guess you are at the forefront there. So has your perspective on drug legalization changed at all since you've been living at the furnace where it's all happening?
I mean, the thing you have to understand living in Mexico is the extent of the state's power, much as living in other places where the government does have a relatively total grasp on power, on the mechanisms of the state, the army, the police. In Mexico, depending on where you are, that equation is a lot more muddled. Police act in concert in places, with local power actors, local families who hold sway. There's a federal army, there's state armies, there's the National Guard, all connected to, different kind of, power dynamics and sources. So it's like, obviously it seems that, legalizing drugs in Mexico would, maybe even be some sort of panacea in some ways, especially if, and I'm not sure if this is palatable to many people, but, if, cartel figures were allowed to participate in the legal economy. But there's obviously the potential for, them just saying no and even going to war with state forces and, causing certain state forces to desert, once they have to choose between their loyalties. So, it's a really difficult question. And it's one that I'm sure AMLO, the president, is grappling with.
There's also, I was speaking with Steve Rolls on Transform, and there's quite a lot of discussion going on about having some kind of regulated cocaine market in Mexico as well. I mean, is that in, or is that just outsiders looking in? Or is there much discussion about that where you are?
As I say, I think the conversation's mostly centered on cannabis at the moment. There's whispers, there's fringe voices, but I think it's mostly in Colombia where there's that discussion, because there was a bill that passed the first reading, I think in the Senate, with the support of a couple dozen senators, I understand. It didn't make the second reading, but yeah, I mean, the former president, Santos, had, spoken about that and had kind of pressurized, the UN alongside the Mexican and Guatemalan governments at the time, I think in 2009, which led to the UNGAS conference. So, yeah, I think that now, especially with the election of the new left-wing president in Colombia, that it's an interesting moment. I think anyone who looks at the situation in Colombia as a mostly producer country will see the benefits of creating a legal market. And yeah, they'll have to secure some sort of UN approval to be able to kind of do those exports. Also, there's cocaine production in Bolivia is rising. And, if they also had access to a global market for coca, I think it would have, supreme benefits for their economy and would, go some way to undoing some of the pain inflicted by the US-led war on drugs in those countries.
Well, that gets us back to your book then. So tell us a bit more about your book and what is the answer? Should all drugs be legalized? And if so, how?
Yeah, it's a very complex question. The book kind of goes into the history of drug use and acknowledges that there's a human inherent desire to, alter our consciousness that goes back a long way, and yeah, is typified daily by our drinking of coffee, of, alcohol, which is made from different kinds of wheat, mainly different hops, rye, barley, and that, yeah, this modern scenario of powders is a kind of relatively newfound situation, and for better or worse, policymakers, responded to it with prohibition. But now we're in this moment where society is a lot more educated, in no part thanks to you and your colleagues, about the benefits and the dangers of these drugs and these plants, and many people misusing drugs like cocaine and methamphetamine like never before, but also people are discovering the healing potential of some of these psychedelics and MDMA like never before. So yeah, when we talk about should all drugs be legalized, it's such a broad thing, but ultimately I think if we look at the history of humanity, bans on any sort of desirable activity or consumable have never really seemed to work unless they've been underpinned by a kind of authoritarian religious structure. And indeed, when those structures are in place, maybe it is suppressing something for later down the line. But as who you've mentioned and his colleagues at Transform and others have outlined, there's various models to look at legalizing drugs. Last week, an MDMA store in Holland opened a kind of mock shop with no MDMA, but to kind of kickstart the conversation. They do have a real shop. It looks the real deal from the photos. It's whether, for something like MDMA, do we have a retail market? Do we have, like the kind of these smart shops, in Holland, where there's a bit of harm reduction advice, but, you don't have to sign up to like a register or anything? Or, do we have something where you have to sign up to a register, do like a speeding awareness course, to go to a kind of pharmacy-based place? Or is it going to be even stricter than that? And, depending on which model one follows, you leave X amount of space open for a black market. So there's that consideration. And, if other drugs are made more available, demand for other potentially more dangerous drugs is likely to go down, which is the reality of, dealers who are upselling.
But do you think there could be a one-size-fits-all model for all drugs in all countries, or do you think we're going to have to look at local needs and feasibilities and practicalities? I mean,
yes, I think with everything, it's advisable to allow local actors to figure out what best situation to pursue in keeping with their cultures and traditions. But certainly, I think, for the most addictive drugs, there's going to have to be more barriers to access than, your kind of magic mushrooms and your cannabis and the other lower harm substances. But I hope, as this conversation moves further along, as more countries legalize cannabis, with Germany looking like it will be the next one, we'll learn the lessons of this kind of laissez-faire regulation in certain US states, which have just led to a corporate takeover. There's no cannabis social clubs. There's no kind of Amsterdam-style cafes where people can gather. There's been, industry interference, at least in Florida, where black farmers have been largely excluded from the market because, clauses, were introduced by the back door to prioritize farmers who'd been going for like 30 odd years and had more than X amount of hectares. And at the same time that, policymakers grapple with these big questions, I think we have serious questions for the alcohol industry. The models obviously differ around the world. In the UK, you can buy vodka on every street corner, whereas in Quebec, Canada, for spirits, it's kind of states stores that are only open between certain times. And, in some ways that does seem like a more responsible system. And, perhaps we could even go further to ensure that people that are obviously suffering under the impact of drinking alcohol are, signposted to support, when each time they're going to the checkout.
Oh, I see. Yes, they get given a card for the local AA, do they?
Well, I mean, that's what, the most responsible model, for these particularly addictive drugs, should be. Although, I'm not sure about kind of abstinence-based recovery for everyone, which is the AA model, although the founder notably spoke highly of the effect of LSD on alcoholism. But I think that, if we can grasp this moment to further a more caring and compassionate society that doesn't stigmatize people that are suffering under the weight of often trauma-led physical dependencies on drugs, including alcohol, and we can put an arm around, people rather than, sending them to jail, which is fortunately, increasingly happening in terms of incarceration rates for drugs in the West. But obviously we can go much further.
I'm not sure it's happening much in Britain, but I don't know. We've doubled our prison population in the last 30 years, almost entirely for people who've got drug problems. I'm interested. So how is your opinion of the UK changed now you've spent considerable time in other countries? I mean, now you can look back to it rather than be part of it. Has your attitude changed? You've seen it differently?
Yeah, it's complicated, the jail data, but to my viewing of it, for people with simple possession and use offences, there's definitely been a downward trajectory in terms of the incarceration rate. But there's obviously a long way to go, and it's a complicated picture, and the data doesn't always reflect the reality. But living outside of the UK now for pushing a year and a half, I guess, you become grateful for the many gifts, the cultural delights, the diversity. But yes, you also get, further insight into just the level of how anachronistic, the UK is. Different countries are obviously governed by a kind of haphazard coalition of, sometimes historically led power factions or just total anomalies. But I think it's much the same in the UK. And we've never, there was obviously the Civil War in the 17th century, but I don't think there's ever been that like real break. And I see that my colleagues and good friends at The Guardian have been covering some of the Queen's misdeeds again in recent weeks, and how laws are used to conserve her economic and political power. We see the ridiculous events in Westminster and the new leadership race for the Conservative Party. But as I say, I think all countries to some degree have their own issues. But I think there's a big problem in the UK with the landed class and the class system and the ingrained privilege and related issues. But, I'm from a working class family, and even though I've got a massive bill, I'm paying back my tuition fees, but I got given a few grants. I also got a loan for my master's. And obviously I'm a good example of, like social climbing, working. So I'm grateful, but living outside and looking back in, the first thing I thought, apart from wanting to be at Glastonbury this year, was, Jesus Christ, what a bunch of like landed codgers that are kind of running the country and, running it into the ground at the expense of, most working people.
Now we know why the Guardian was so pleased to take you on. Or maybe you probably had those views from the very beginning.
Yeah, I mean, like, I'm not really seeking to be like a commentator on society or indeed drugs. As I say, like, the publisher kind of approached me to do the book, and it seemed like a good opportunity. And obviously everyone wants to write a book, when they're a journalist. But Britain is also a place where many people from diverse backgrounds have been able to give their families, a much, much better life. But there's, clearly some kind of fundamental issues which the RMT union have notably been bringing to the headlines recently.
So you still do keep quite close, obviously. You're reading The Guardian online, are you?
I mean, I'm tuning in when Mick Lynch is on the soapbox. And I think it's great that more working class, people have been brought onto the telly due to this rail strike. And, I think his and others' appearances have really demonstrated, the lack of working class voices on the telly, which I think has been a trend, since the Thatcher years. And, how much sense, normal working people that are there on the ground, shoulder to shoulder with the people that are facing the brunt of these kind of, macro issues, the kind of SW1 class, kind of pontificating around, although there are some excellent pundits, many of whom write for The Guardian.
So let me just finish by, what's your next book? Do you have a plan? Are you going to write another expose, or what are you next going to, you have another ambition? Are you going to write a novel or what?
Well, I mean, that's why I came onto the podcast, David, to kind of pitch around, any interested publishers or agents that are tuning in, looking for the new talent.
Go on then, pitch now.
Well, I mean, then everyone will know the idea. But I mean, on a very broad level, I think, in step with, the rising consciousness and mainstreaming of psychedelics and the increasing popularity of practices like meditation and yoga. I think there's a kind of rising consciousness in some ways. I read recently that the Comanches prophesied this in the Eagle and the Condor prophecy. And I think that, this moment is really, really exciting. I think a lot of people figuring out how to live, healthier lives that are more in tune with the natural world. And it doesn't come a minute too late with these temperatures we're seeing, in the UK today. I see you wearing a polo shirt. So I think something that delves into that and finds some interesting stories that illustrate the journey that many people and societies have been on, and, the barriers that are faced to really kind of realize this paradise that we could all be living in.
Well, Mattha. Mattha, I've got it right at last, Mattha.
Third time lucky. I've sent you enough emails, but we haven't spoken enough. We were on the Owen Jones show last year.
But I'm going to master it now. Mattha Busby. I hope there are some publishers listening to this who will come to you and give you that advance you need so that you can really get into the depth of this relationship of humans, plants in the future. So good luck to you there. Thank you so much for coming on the program. Obviously, when you go back to Mexico, whatever you do, stay safe. Thank you very much.
Yes. Thanks a lot, David. Thanks for the support. Thanks for having me on.
Great. Thank you.
Cheers.